The thrust of Ken Bailey's scholarship was his focus on the parables of Jesus. But while he was doing that work, he was also fascinated with the Apostle Paul. As early as the early 1970s, Bailey began to study 1 Corinthians because he was seeing in 1 Corinthians some of the same poetic structures that he was seeing in the parables of Jesus. And he traces both of these back, the writings of Paul and the sayings and the stories of Jesus. He traces them both back to the Psalms and to the prophets of the Old Testament. And Bailey would consider that Isaiah was probably the greatest literary practitioner of this Hebraic style of chiasm that both Paul and Jesus used. And what Bailey argues is that in 1 Corinthians, what we're seeing, or what we should be seeing but we're not seeing, is that 1 Corinthians is a collection of 5 homilies, as he puts it. And each of these 5 homilies has within it a collection of poems, which are making the points that Paul is presenting. This is not the way that we have traditionally interpreted the Apostle Paul. Usually scholars imagine the Apostle Paul is a very busy man and a very impatient man, and he's pacing up and down the room and dictating his letters. When he comes to a concluding point, he'll stop and come back the next day and pick up where he left off. Or maybe as he picks up where he left off, he actually repeats some of what he said before. Maybe he picks up a totally new thing without making an easy transition. And so what we're seeing in Paul then is a very difficult writer, because the letters that he's written seem to be, to our minds, very disjointed, where he begins one idea and then goes to another idea and then goes back to the former idea and so forth. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul is dealing with the issue of meat that isn't sacrificed to idols and whether or not Christians should eat it. And then in the next chapter, he presents the beautiful poem on love, 1 Corinthians 13. And we're expecting him to elaborate that in the next chapter, but he doesn't. In the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul goes back to the theme of meat sacrifice to idols. So what's going on here? Is Paul a disorganized, disjointed, impatient writer who refuses to go back and edit his material properly? And Bailey says, no, this is an indication, these are telltale signs that Paul is thinking chiastically, as a Jew of the first century would naturally have been thinking. The fact that he's going back to this earlier point suggests that there's a much broader structure to the story, or to the letter that we're not seeing. And so Bailey writes an entire book on this, certainly his longest book, Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes. So he's written Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, but Paul through Mediterranean eyes, because Paul was bicultural. He was Jewish, but he was also very much involved with Greek culture. And we see both themes, both ideas in Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians. But curiously, we don't see it in his other writings. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, I understand that you really didn't understand my last letter very carefully, very well. And I'll try to do better and try to speak more plainly so you understand what I mean. And that's what he's doing in 2 Corinthians. So what Bailey speculates is that Paul, like Jesus, had inherited this Hebraic tradition, and he attempts to reproduce it in Greek for an audience that's largely illiterate, that's largely Greek rather than Hebrew or having a Jewish background. And so they're just simply incapable of understanding what Paul is doing. So he drops that. So all of Paul's other letters then are straightforward prose. But First Corinthians is the exception. 1 Corinthians shows us that Paul, like Jesus, was a careful literary craftsman who produces what appears to be prose in English, but in fact is actually a man thinking in classic Hebraic forms.